So bootleg culture, the gift economy, and the whole notion of creativity, right now for software and anyone involved with digital media and contemporary aesthetics, it's about these kinds of networks of exchange. So there's a kind of a Deleuzian aspect going on here. It's a rhizomatic situation. It's looking at how people create a culture and new kinds of value out of these exchange places that are actually essentially free. So if memory is cheap, which it is now, I mean, these hold several hundred megabytes, the DVDs are all several gigabytes, then as memory gets cheaper and cheaper and everyone's able to document and make and mix and do all sorts of stuff, you're going to be looking at a situation where these kinds of fragments become part of your archive and your creative palette. So for me, the sample and the idea of the whole, you know, a fragment versus the whole, are something that are almost, it's like the ambiguity is no longer even vaguely relevant, because the fragment represents something that I would easily make into a whole track. If you got a CD of just like Max Roach's drum solos, which some of you might have gotten, then maybe you could take that and sample it and make some beats out of it. Or if you got a CD that had a lot of songs from the Middle East, why not make it remix or sample and do a digital media thing and create, you know, the idea is creativity and exchange. So behind me, you have a photograph from the cover of Scientific American in 1915. That's a photograph series by Eddie and Jules Murray. It's a little blurry. He's one of the first people to really popularize the idea of what they call stop motion photography. So what you're seeing here is basically the camera being able to break apart human motion. So at that time period, this was considered a radical departure from how the human eye had visualized movement. But imagine the same thing going on with sound, where you're hearing fragments of sound. And that's what sampling is about. That's visual sampling. So digital media allows us a series of tools that let you really break apart most of the narratives and bits and pieces that the 20th century and 19th century kind of gave us as part of our palette. The painters of the early 20th century, whether you were a cubist or whether you were someone like Luigi Russolo, who wrote The Art of Noise, it's a very famous manifesto, in 1915, he was still painting these kinds of composite cubist-based works, or even Picasso. So you can see how perspective in the early 20th century really, this kind of breaking apart of motion, you know, the cubist, if you look at Marcel Duchamp's most famous painting, Nude Descending a Stairs, there you go. So I'm going to get a little old school on you guys. Oh wow, can we turn off some of the lights? It's probably a bit hard to read. Yeah, the Gesamtkunstwerk Wagner was championing in the 19th century really, I think, set the tone for some of the early multimedia we look at, including the sense of being able to actually control everything in a physical space by using, I guess, is it possible to turn on rows of the lights? Yeah.
More dark.
Working on it. I'm hitting the button that says darker.
Okay, cool.
Very good.
Can you guys see that? Can most people see? Okay, majority rule. So, okay, Wagner, German high culture, the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, you know, Bayreuth, Nietzsche, all these kinds of situations that were going on in the 19th century really hit a crossroads with both philosophy and aesthetics, with this Wagnerian sense of, okay, the Gesamtkunstwerk. Now, if anybody speaks German, you know this means total artwork. And that means is kind of looking at lighting, theater, and how the dramatic impulse of the director would be able to be interpreted by the composer, but through the collapse of the different roles. So you have the director as the composer and the lighting designer. So you're seeing a consolidation of what essentially throughout the history of theater have been very separate pieces of material. So when I say pieces of material, I'm not talking about the artist themselves, but the role that they play. It's a kind of malleable subject. So with Wagner and the Gesamtkunstwerk, what you're seeing is like, basically he wanted to take Europe back to ancient Greece and think about how the Greeks had really synthesized different traditions to come up with what they called classical theater. So when I was in the middle of several projects a couple of years ago, the Gesamtkunstwerk was really lingering over my ideas about DJ culture, because it's about synthesis, it's about pulling from radically disparate cultures and creating new forms out of them. So like 2 years ago, I ended up getting the rights to D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation from 1915. And I'm sure most of you know this film. It's a very notorious, very racist film. It's predominantly black people represented by white and blackface, and it was also the first film to play at the White House. So most people would like shudder to hear that Wagner has any relationship to Birth of a Nation, but what I'll do is kind of draw a little parallel. Do most of you guys see Apocalypse Now, you know, the Coppola film? There's a very famous scene in the film where the helicopters are about to bomb a Vietnamese village, and one of the main sergeants or colonels says, you know, the problem with Charlie is Charlie doesn't surf. So they have these helicopters with speakers playing Wagner. Remember this? Yeah. So that scene was inspired by Birth of a Nation. There's a very famous scene where it's called The Ride of the Valkyrie, and of course the Wagner one. In the D.W. Griffith one, it was called The Ride of the Klansmen. So Coppola and George Lucas and a couple other composers and filmmakers, everybody refers back to Birth of a Nation as a kind of American update of Wagner. In fact, the soundtrack was all based on Wagner, and so the scenes were assigned Wagnerian materials from the Ring cycle. So if a Klansman is riding, you hear a combination of Dixie and the Flight of the Valkyrie. It was very strange. So I'm going to take you into another composer, Scriabin, who came up with this concept of what he liked to call kind of color pattern recognition. Scriabin had an opera, sort of symphony, sort of multimedia piece called Prometheus, the Symphony of Fire, where he felt that every tone in the symphony was meant to be given a series of color patterns and motifs that were actually specific to lighting. So if you heard certain sounds, they were meant to be linked. Again, this is a very prototype of multimedia. They were meant to be linked by rhythm pattern and structure to specific lighting patterns. So what you're seeing here is a European tradition of looking at synthesizing pattern recognition with lighting. Now, if you fast forward to Andy Warhol in the late 60s and the whole idea of the exploding plastic inevitable that was going on in downtown Manhattan, or the happenings of Alan Capro, or the kind of conceptual art of people like Mel Bachner, this idea of conceptualizing a composition and making it become more and more abstract to the point where the abstraction was the composition is kind of a really nice middle ground between the early 20th century and the late 20th century's relationship to aesthetics. So abstraction and the idea of figurative representation or realism now becomes part of a very, very devolved process. Painters have given up realism. The idea of a composer making a nice, happy Mahler, well, Mahler's not so happy, but I don't know, Bach or something. That kind of stuff after World War I and World War II is almost impossible. People like Pierre Boulez or the Italian futurists, they weren't trying to make nice, happy music for you to drink a beer to in a pub. So the pun and metaphor that I'm coming up with this idea of synthesis and Gesamtkunstwerk is not only about looking at multimedia as a kind of a continuous reflection of the industrial and economic and warfare processes of what was going on in Europe, but globalization itself. So as people lose these kinds of reference points, they begin to actually create new forms. So behind me you have one of my favorite pieces to think about this idea of the economy and early globalization is the Harrison clock of 1764. John Harrison was an inventor who came up with what we call longitude. It was the structure that put the world on the grid, you know, the whole longitude, latitude system. The British Empire, at the height of the empire, was losing a lot of ships because they had a lot of navigation failures, ships were drifting off, and they actually commissioned a contest to hire people to figure out how do we keep our ships in the navigation routes. They offered, I think, a £20,000 reward to whoever could come up with a way of routing and keeping these networks of the navigation routes locked into a global pattern. So Harrison came up with what they called the Harrison clock, or the H4. And when I was working on a project a couple of years ago, we got in touch with the British Admiralty and asked them if we could record the sound of the clock. Essentially, it's the first sound of globalization. If you think about latitude and longitude, it's essentially a grid organizing human experience into a systematic structure, the grid. So the Harrison clock, we put graffiti tags on it in high resolution. And one of the funnier things was like, why does a DJ want the sound of the clock? And so it was kind of always a sense of translation. And I had to tell the British Admiral, I was like, okay, you guys are the British, you know, you're Greenwich Meridian time, you're an ego-tripping empire, so you just put yourself in the middle, right? You know, so Greenwich, you know, zero time, and then the time zones actually becomes the sense of a metronome, you know. So that's a rhythm.